Thank you. And good evening, everyone. My name's Tom Emerson. I'm an architect here in London at 6A Architects, but also teach at ETH in Zurich. So I have a kind of a foot both here in this series and in London, but also with the many guests that have been here over the last few weeks. So thanks all for coming. For this last in the afterFORM series, presenting the new generation of Swiss practice. And thanks to LS, Architecture Foundation, Swiss Embassy, and the Barbican for hosting it. If you go to the website or Instagram page of tonight's speakers, Charlotte Truwant and Dries Rodet, you'll find an image of their studio. It's like models displayed with kind of casual elegance alongside some tools of the trade. It's a typical form of communication which architects, makers, artists have used for centuries. By presenting their apparently real working situation, they can communicate values and skills without showing off. A ceramicist may show turning wheels, wire cutters, timber formers, all cast in a brown earthiness of unfired clay, or a sound engineer will be surrounded by all manner of cables and connections, dials, buttons, and touchscreens. A carpenter used to have racks of strangely shaped planes, saws and chisels, and today they just have neatly stacked boxes by Festool. But the most memorable of these photos by an architect for me was a picture promoted by Renzo Piano for years of a building workshop. It was a workbench with woodworking tools and a pegboard holding lots of beautifully crafted steel and timber connections. The message here was clearly of craftsmanship and lightness inspired by sailing boats and of embodied knowledge. The fact that Piano at the time was engaged in producing huge urban projects of glass, steel bonded together with silicon designed in CAD and BIM, such as the Shard down the road, in no way diminished the enthusiasm of the sociologist Richard Sennett to write about Piano as the ultimate architect craftsman and the certainty of simple handmade ingenuity. The studio or workshop is a kind of cabinet of curiosities that represents an idealized world of creativity and production. In Truwant+Rodet's image, which was posted on the 21st of November 2021, if you want to look it up, you'll see architectural models arranged on metal shelves alongside a collection of objects and tools. These shelves are the staple of contemporary architectural practice. Standard galvanized steel industrial model. We have them in our office. I think everybody does. There's a freestanding photographic spotlight reflector in the top left corner, confirming that this is a highly composed setup. So I was intrigued by the space given to a foam cutter, a remnant of a kind of OMA world of the 90s of styrofoam massing models. And in the foreground, there are architectural models and upturned models of tables on timber board, lying on a thick slab of blue insulation, which could be both support, maybe also a material resource for models to come. I thought that styrofoam or XPS had been cancelled in buildings, and by extension, from models. It represents everything that is wrong in the building industry, a kind of hyper-object, as Tim Morton called it, made from fossil fuels that have been destroyed, that have destroyed so much, yet the material itself cannot be destroyed. There are also models of furniture, lightly triangulated, a silver ball, a kind of high-tech machine, aesthetic. Then there is a plant in a pot and a series of strange materials of uncertain form and color. It's not clear if they're objects or samples. Are they one-to-one or landscape models of mountain ranges or valleys? Are they found or are they made? Is it a thing or is it a process? Is it unfinished or just decaying? I think that this might be the question. And this image, I think, points towards this evening's talk, a talk about architecture extending the realm of design artifacts and space to extremes in times and scale. Some of the models and reference images suggest machines, and dare I say it, the aesthetics of 80s high-tech of the Lloyd's building, again, only a few feet from here. Some of their references look like ballistic analysis of bullets, unique traces, or a biologist's microphotography. But it could be a satellite image of the Earth's surface. And you wonder if enzymes are now building materials. You never know. Charlotte and Dries are practice in Basel, but their experience and origins and influences are pan-European and even global. But I sense a very strong affinity to the Belgian-French axis. They've collaborated with Office, Kirsten Geers, David van Severen, with landscape architect Bas Smet, and have just won a huge competition in Basel, working with Brüter and Jan Kinsberger. For years, they've been immersed in teaching too, at EPFL and currently at ETH and Versailles, where their commitment to the autonomy of the architectural project is matched now and maybe even exceeded by temporal and territorial concerns approaching natural history and contemporary ecology. They layer narratives from deep time with concerns of everyday life, organic biological mutations with building technology, all with the promise that architecture, whether found, adapted, newly constructed, is natural, maybe even polystyrene. So please join me in welcoming Charlotte and Dries. Thank you. Hello.
Hi. Can you, yeah. Hi everyone, thanks Tom for this very nice introduction. So we are gonna, thanks everyone for being here, despite the very nice warm weather outside, joining us for this lecture and our journey or through some of the project we decided to present to you tonight. So I'm Charlotte Truwant. This is my partner, Dries Rodet, and we both have an office based in Basel. But this is not only us. There is also a lot of people collaborating with us and joining the team. And this collaboration, the plus, everyone always asks us why. This is our collaborators, but it also expands, and this is the way we conduct our practice, to somehow always collaborate with other experts, with field outside of the discipline of architecture, and somehow to always, it allows us, because we are curious, to also always remain curious and open, always be critical, and always get a feedback. So we moved together with a lot of with a collective of graphic designers, architects, curators, writers, together in this former garage in the center of Basel, which we slightly renovated, and which somehow has a beauty in the fact that it's extremely generous, and it talks to us today about this question of generosity. What does it mean to have such a space where you can welcome, when you can organize events? At the same time, of course, it comes with certain type of constraints. It's very cold in winter. One has to put a jacket on, or it's warm in summer. There's no window, etc. So the question somehow as architect to have an office, and we are not the only one, this is also because, of course, it's very affordable. And as architect, we need space, like to produce, to make models. I think we have to look for cheaper spaces. But on the other hand, I think was a very important moment also, because there's a shift in the discussion in what is comfort today. I think to also to be challenged, and also to experience what it means in this space, and to set the cursor of our profession. So of course, this space allows, and everyone can adapt, allows to have internal events and social events. So together, Dries and Melissa Frödiger and I, we also have next to our practice an association, Das Verein, which somehow organize lectures outside the scope of institutions in Basel, and somehow allows also young practice to have a space to talk. And let's say it's a bit more casual, and it's also a place to have debate, and it took the form of lectures. I think some of the lectures were also present here. They're friends there, but this is also spaces where one can organize, workshop, when one can have discussion, when one can set exhibition in motion. So this is really an important space, and as Tom described, a tiny fragment of our office. Now you see it in a larger context. You also see the lamp back again here, and I think indeed this is really, sometimes it's a construct like the image you mentioned, but this is also something really influencing our work. So now, here, being in London to talk about afterFORM. Since the Industrial Revolution, Western civilization had attempted to control the environment in order to turn it into productive resource, to control space, politic uses, and forms. But we are at a time when questions of form and composition may persist, but are no longer sufficient to deal with the depth and complexity of today's situation. We prefer to Embrace the seemingly arbitrary traces of nature growing in between landscapes, the transient density of a fog, the unstable logic of the course of the Mississippi River, the controlled humidity in a botanical greenhouse, the apparent randomness of a set of chairs on a summer terrace. We would rather think of form through the lens of landscape, through the lens of topography, maybe. Through the lens of hydrography. Through the lens of geology. And finally, through the lens of uncertainty. Uncertainty at the threshold between disciplines, between an object and its environment, between interior and exterior, at the threshold between landscape and architecture. And those, as you see on the screen, are the space that really fascinates us, the space that are blurred, the space that are somehow undefined, the space that happens in between when an object encounters its environment or another system. A threshold as a space where everything is open to interpretation, is blurred, or has different meaning. A space of contamination where an object articulates its environment or the other way around, where architecture is not finished and static, but rather open to uncertainty and evolution, when uncertainty is the only certainty. So this first project we are presenting you tonight after this series of somehow collage of other projects we were conducting in the office is what one calls it's Kunst am Bau. It's the 1% of art in a building. So this is a commission given. It's a competition in Switzerland. It's a competition, and together with Fabian Marti, a Swiss artist from Zurich. Formerly photographer, but also a sculptor. we made a proposal for this park in Lausanne, next to Lausanne. So the park and the campus are located on the slopes next to the Lake of Geneva, on the edge of the Lake Geneva. The park, is somehow the background, or is somehow the plot where Jan Kinsbergen won the competition, a sort of master plan for a campus, Health Campus Santé, to welcome different institutions and university. And very consciously, we decided not to set ourselves within the premises, within the space of the building, but rather in between, and try to interfere with the built object and the landscape. So we propose a fountain in this new central element of the campus, reinforcing the public character of the park. The fountain uses the natural slope of the terrain, of the topography. Sometimes it will run parallel to it, perpendicular, and it will use the slope as an opportunity instead of an obstacle in the design. In mythology and in the Bible, water has always occupied a preponderant place as a source of life. And the project, Fountain of Youth, also known as the Fountain of Life or Fountain of Immortality, is one of these legends, which our project refers to in this idea of the sequences between these different places and spaces. So the project, as you can see, stretches almost horizontally across the landscape, and is this very long elongated fountain, which become on its own. It's not an object anymore, but it becomes on its own almost a landscape element. One of the inspiration, or one of the reference, not to call it inspiration, but one of the reference for this project was the project of Palladio for the Villa Barbaro in Italy, northern Italy, in the Veneto, where somehow it uses water as almost, let's say, the infrastructure in the house. So he uses water at the top of the topography. There he has this sort of water reservoir to collect water, rainwater, and running water from the slope, which he then distributes throughout the terrain, throughout the site, to cool down the house, but also it serves in the kitchen, of course, for cooking, etc. And it finishes in these scopes of fountain outside in front of the garden. So this idea that also water is an element that it's a resource, but it's also an element that becomes almost the infrastructure of the project, was a guiding element in this project. So our proposal was to collect rainwater on top of Jan Kinsbergen building. And I would say in 2023, it's nothing new, but we won this competition in 2018. And at the time, we were kind of shocked to know that all the rainwater collected on the roof was actually evacuated down in the canalization and back into the recycling water plant at the bottom next to the lake. And we propose to reinfiltrate the water on the waterbed, on the terrain itself, rather than putting it outside and evacuating the water. So that was already to convince at the time. I think today is not really an issue anymore, but convincing authority communes that actually keeping the water on site was a necessity was already the first step of the project. And then we use this this natural phenomenon of the, communicating vases. To somehow put the canalization under pressure and irrigate a reservoir at the top of the hill, which you see in red there, from which the water will slowly run down back to the source. And then, as I don't know if it's a project that's known in Switzerland, this is a very important, so Meret Oppenheim is a very important artist, a sculptor as well. And she designed in Bern this fountain, the Meret Oppenheim fountain, as a sort of infrastructure that somehow grows. As the water is running down, there are like sediment accumulating on it, and plants and deposits and seeds accumulating, and the fountain grows with the time. And I think that's a very for us that's a very important reference in our work. And we always ask ourselves, how can we translate that also later into architecture, but also. In this project specifically, this is also the sort of similar system that we try to apply through the site. So horizontally from the top here, which you see on the top left, which is the source, which is at the bottom, where you have this reservoir, which is punctuated, where water is somehow slowly running through. So depending on the type, the way you treat the material, depending on the type of openings you're doing, depending on the kind of way to vehicle the water down the slopes, you will have or not sediments accumulation, and you will trigger more or less this kind of landscape deposits. So I think we worked with that and this idea of sequences. So from the source here at the top, then perpendicular to the slope, we have this channel where the water is clearly somehow running quite fast, because the material used is rather either it's argile or clay or something that kind of accelerate the water, and then it kind of takes a curve and runs parallel to the landscape into this sort of open gutter, which refer to a system we have in valleys. It's called BIS. It's a system to transport water across the Alps. And slowly, so it's this open gutter. So of course, when there's too much water, it kind of flood into the terrains, and you will have a different kind of vegetation happening around to finish at the bottom again into this sort of mirror of water. So somehow the project is this kind of deconstruction of these different elements, these different mythological elements into the landscape to kind of blend in at the end, where the limit between the fountain and the park, which is then designed by Studio Vulcan, so this landscape office from Zurich, so where the fountain and the parks are not clearly visible. And it's more the idea that even this long gutter is not an object that will be visible. What will be visible, or what we hope will be visible, is more the trace of flowers or the type of plants that will grow at this specific space along, because you will have there some water running more than next to it. So the vegetation should reveal more the fountain than the other way around. To continue on landscape and zooming in, or this relationship now between landscape and architecture, asking ourselves, can landscape become the foreground, or can, instead of always having architecture being the foreground of landscape as a background? I think this project was an interesting try, or it's for a competition, so it was for this year's biennial. So obviously, we didn't win. Someone else presented their project. There are some similarities in the topic, but I think this is a competition we did together with TEN, also an office in Zurich. And when we started working and we received the floor plans of the pavilion, which we all know, but we are always intrigued, and we're always fascinated also, Dries and I, to dig and also to discover what's the history behind the place. If one wants to also talk about the relationship between architecture and the context, one has to also look a bit like a detective into what happens in the past, what are the different elements that constitute the history, the layers of a place. We discovered that before 1952, Switzerland was occupying a pavilion that was built in a classical style in St. Helena. The pavilion wasn't suited for the hot and humid climate of Venice, and Switzerland got appointed the site next to the entry of the biennale. With the opportunity to build a new pavilion next to the entrance came the wish to present a modern image of Switzerland through a series of spaces, incorporating climatic constraints and negotiating with the landscape. There was the wish to present, negotiating with the landscape and build around the tree, which forms at large the Giardini. Of course, from the lagoon, it is remarkable because the Giardini, because it is perceived as a horizontal forest, which is composed of oaks, pine, plane trees, and magnolias. So these green curtains, in a way, from the lagoon, this green curtain doesn't allow any construction to be seen. And one of the most exceptional aspects of the biennale is the character to which its name referred, Giardini, which was transformed under Napoleonic occupation into a public garden, and finally dedicated from 1895 to the Biennale of Art. So it's a park of this size. A park of this size is very rare in the dense fabric of Venice, but of course nowadays was also our what we can acknowledge is that it's actually closed to the public 6 months a year because of the biennale, the art and architecture biennale. So it's not anymore per se only a public park. But what strikes us actually is that most of the representation of the pavilions, when one look into books, internet, etc., you see here, this is the floor plans taken from the book of Dina, Common Pavilions, put again ordered chronologically on a paper, that we ordered chronologically on a paper, just to understand also the evolution of typology through times. But it's very rare to find, most of the time one finds plan or floor plans on a white background. But actually what's interesting is to note that the word pavilion, etymologically, it refers to an architectural device that maintains a servant relationship to its environment. So normally, the pavilion, let's say in British, for instance, in British landscape or in Italian landscape, is usually at the service of landscape. It's usually there to articulate a sequence. But it's never a foreground and never something that one can detach from its context. And I think in Venice, we were pretty struck to find actually absolutely no plans of the Giardini itself with the park and the pavilion at the same time. So that was our first, let's say, mapping the park was somehow our first proposal to recontextualize those pavilions. This is an exercise we did in 2017 when we participate in another biennale, but which we somehow continue for this one. And I think what mapping the park, when one in landscape map, also landscape system, one also understands systems have their own logic. And I think showing those layers together, one starts to look at the pavilion, the Swiss pavilion in this case, in a different way. What you can see here, for instance, on top is that those are the reminiscence of the former planted alley that were there before the Swiss, the Venezuelan pavilion, and the other pavilion were built. So later on, once Switzerland, for instance, got allocated there, a new planted alley got set in front. They are much smaller trees. I mean, now they're bigger. And I think what's interesting is that, of course, it explained the story that will come, that somehow the trees themselves, if we would map the roots of them, go much further and outside of the boundary of the wall of the pavilion, obviously. And today, when we started the competition, we were told that actually the tree, which stand there across this wall, one can see also on the walls the cracks, probably the kind of the fight between the tree and the wall to stand next to each other. We heard, or we were told, that the tree was dead and it would have to somehow be cut and come down. So our first question was, what should we do with this tree? What happens when this tree falls? And how can this, and this became the premises of the project. On the other hand, we looked at the pavilion on its own. 61 years of exhibition, hot climates, leave traces on the pavilion. And through careful maintenance over the year, the pavilion has been transformed severely. But instead of trying to restore the pavilion, we would have liked to show this continuous process of adaptation, showing how the Swiss pavilion and the garden have been changing over the time. As all the other pavilions in the Giardini, there are 29 pavilions, 69 national pavilions throughout Venice. They are every year altered, transformed, filled in, stripped down, open to the public, and abandoned, dismantled, stripped, repaired, and finally renovated. So the project was somehow to incorporate this idea, and the project was a time-based project, that to incorporate the idea of time. The project would have started in January last year by somehow doing a survey and already acting right after the Art Biennial was finished, acting also continuously on the pavilion itself, coming there and working around those questions. So our proposal was to reveal the roots and to kind of open the pavilion by revealing the roots and creating this long pit, using the trunk of the tree on top of the wall to reinforce and to make it as a beam, activating this existing climate, these very, very simple low-tech climatic elements which allow this sort of cross ventilation. So you see these little black squares, which are somehow the places where the air is taken in and out. Moving the earth that was taken out from around the tree, so this root airbrushing system, to put it inside of the main space and to allow somehow with this system of water dripping system to allow to create a new sort of interior garden. And at the same time continuously working with this idea of taking down or like revealing the traces of the former exhibition throughout the whole process. So how can time become a material in architecture? This is a project, a competition, again, a competition entry, which we also didn't win, but that was really exciting to do. So that was during the Architecture Week in Basel last year. The committee decided to organize a competition and invite 20 offices to work on the topic of reuse, and we would be given a certain amount of material and this site. So we ask ourselves, beyond designing an object which illustrates the idea of reuse, time as material, our project proposes to think of the mechanism of reuse as a set of interventions that activate, interfere, and transform the context of Dreispitz in Basel. So Dreispitz, it's this sort of, it's a plateau between a hill and a valley in Bruderholz. Between the hill of Bruderholz and the valley of the Birs. So it is still a logistic area where most of the train entering Switzerland, where somehow some of them were conveyed, and where you find today still a lot of industry and logistic. So what characterizes this site, as you see here in blue, is the strong presence of the rails, of course, which somehow reinforce the connection throughout the site. So through a linear park, we propose somehow that the project would use the rail and turn it into a linear park to connect different buildings together and not only focus on the object of reuse, but rather use the site as a starting point. To narrow it down, the site is just in front of this very interesting piece of engineering from PMM engineer in Basel. And that was somehow also, we ask ourselves, can the existing building, the context, also become some resources for the project? This is the catalog that I mentioned before that was given to all participants, where one would have to pick some elements. This was a very well-curated catalog where each element was listed. There was a 3D model. There was the embodied CO2 emission that one would save by using this material. There were the dimension, the amount available. So somehow the work done by Circular, so this is this office in Switzerland that are extremely active. It was founded by Barbara Buser, who's now more known in the field, or who is at least in Switzerland behind this whole topic. But beyond reusing only the element, we decided to reuse also the site, as I explained before. And this started with a careful survey of the existing, which of course everyone, or in the brief, was described as a terrain vague. But when one started to look closer, of course, we, on the micro scale, we start to discover many the presence of vegetation, fauna, flora, etc. And somehow the process of zooming in is very also important to understand, and not only looking at it from the top and in plan, but it's very important also to acknowledge this context. So giving a new purpose to this site isn't only about building new structure, but it's also about revealing its potential and changing the perception from an infrastructure to a 100-meter-long new public landscape. Once again, to create this landscape in a short time, one would have had to start right at the beginning by planting seeds, by going on site, and by trying to activate on the day of the opening to have already a bit more of an extensive park. One would have had to start early on the project. And somehow we would have colonized the space in between the track to make them also accessible. So next to this, with this long, this existing park, or this pre-existing park, we propose to build a structure that would define a new centrality in front of this parking that I showed before. And this structure would somehow be this point that articulate once again different different moments, sequences in the landscape, and also work once again our interest in the water with this water collection that would also somehow activate differently the landscape around. So this structure was made as a large scale truss, which is made of many IP profile and assembled together, as you see in these yellow knots. This was designed together with our engineer, so I think it's Neven Kocic, which I think is a very challenging but very interesting challenge. And on top, so we pre-stressed the structure, which allowed us to somehow lay on top of it this shell and create this center. And the structure itself is then anchored, as you might have seen before on the plan, to the existing buildings. So the canopy leaning against the structure become the new center of this park. And at this point, it is a structure that can be appropriated, and it offers a place to a myriad of different programs and users. It's a catalyzer for public debate, weekend works out, parties, etc. But it's also a new habitat for local fauna and flora. The pavilion would have been in constant process of material coming in and out, merging again with the context. It would be growing and shrinking. It can be revised, adapt, depending on the need, the uses, and the performance. Once the structure disappeared again, the park will keep on growing towards a beautiful and certain future.
To continue, this idea of time and material and kind of somehow how can buildings also not be static and not be finished at the point when the architect delivers the building, and kind of can we actually think together with a client to a project that is more adaptable in time. We wanted to also talk about a project right next to Basel in Grenzach for the extension of a one-family house. Like you can see here, it's on the slope, looking onto the Rhine, a bit shoved back in the line. Quite an exceptional house. Built by Wolfgang Wetzel in 1964. Very LA for Basel, with its kind of super high ceilings and kind of quite an interesting floor plan where all the living quarters are, all the sleeping quarters are pushed in the back of the slope in a very compact area to liberate the whole floor for living and kitchen. With this 45-degree angled floor plan that opens up to a balcony and actually gives always access directly to the garden. And then the floor below is almost an independent studio. Here you see the living spaces with their 3-meter-high ceilings and these open corners where you always can walk outside straight into the garden. And in the back, the house digs straight into the hill. And actually, you can almost walk straight from the hill onto the roof. So when the clients came to us, it was around COVID, and they suddenly realized like it's very hard to work in this one-floor house. They both have quite a demanding job. They don't have an office space. Everything is an open floor plan, and the bathroom is in this kind of very compact backspace. It's very functional, and they wanted to have a little bit more hedonistic space to live in. So quite fast came the question, okay, we can build on the roof something not to occupy any more the terrain with this beautiful garden. But what can we do on the roof? Kind of the minimum what we need, just something to protect us against the rain, have from the hill the wind coming through, and almost pull the garden just on the roof. So again, you have this relationship in a very direct manner with the garden. With the only demands in the beginning somehow of making a space that is has a nice temperature in winter and that is actually quite open in summer. And quite fast we came with this very light roof structure with a set of elements that were somehow dispersed on the roof, incorporating the chimneys that were already on the roof, as almost like garden sculptures sitting there together on the roof. And they would somehow, big cupboards would somehow separate then office spaces and a bathroom space, but keeping it all very light and open. We would recuperate the water in a big tank, because the garden needs a lot of water in the hot summers. Give a new access to the sauna that was already existing. And the goal of the clients was then also at the same time, they were wondering, like, can we, in the future, maybe, you know, we're not going to use it as an office anymore, so maybe we actually want our parents to live in the ground floor, we live on the first floor, and maybe our daughter will live on the top floor. So how can we this big house turn it also in 3 houses, or maybe not, or yeah, maybe it's nicer to have just a very big bathroom. And these kind of questions, they stayed always very open. And at one point we were actually wondering, like, can we not, together with them as a family, growing and changing their opinion about life, can we also not build a house for that? And that they, together with the house, they grow. So the floor plan went from a quite graphical floor plan following the geometry of the house of before, to an extremely simple floor plan. Just like, what is the basic we can do? How can we make a house that actually has nothing in it? Can a house in itself be just an infrastructure? Can it just be a roof that gives access a bit to the garden on the roof? And keep actually all options open. The only things we keep is actually the water retaining elements and a small access here in the back to the roof, to the house. And how can this house then turn over time in whatever they need it to be? So to have a continuous floor inside and outside, like they had on their own floor, we actually raised the whole floor inside, giving a hollow floor that gave the possibility then to also in the future change whatever piping they would need, keeping it somehow open by having this floating floor. Maybe one of the first things that could come in there is actually a bathroom. It could be a very simple thing. Maybe later on it has to be separated. Maybe there needs to be suddenly cupboards in there that becomes walls. Maybe we need sliding doors. Maybe it needs to be very dense over time and grow to something much more complex. But for the moment, we keep it as open as possible, and we go together with the clients on this journey and see where it ends up. And this idea of somehow, how can we do the minimum and keep the idea somehow as the building is more as an infrastructure that we start to furnish and we start to live in, or that the clients start to live in and occupy and evolve together with the building. We try to also continue in a project we won in 2020 for the Centre Culturel Suisse in Paris, together with the Parisian office ASBR of Thomas Reynaud and Marie Boenders. And the Centre Culturel Suisse is in the Marais in Paris. It's a very typical French situation. So the whole building almost is situated within the building block and has only a tiny facade on the street that for today is actually just a bookshop. And the real entry of the Centre Culturel Suisse is actually through a very tiny dead-end street on the side. You have to almost be one of the lucky ones who knows where it is to actually find it. Inside there is on the top there is a large exhibition space. On the ground floor there's a theater space, and in the front there's still a small exhibition space. But actually they use every square meter they have left. On the courtyard becomes suddenly an exhibition space, the shop window or the foyer. The program is very ambitious of the Centre Culturel Suisse, also sometimes even quite controversial, like in 2004 with Thomas Hirschhorn. And it becomes somehow a ground for experimentation inside a context that today is very white cube and black box. The buildings themselves, so here you see the whole floor plan, the front and the back. And to quickly give a bit a context, because it's very hard to understand otherwise, the history makes it easier to understand. So this is a Hôtel Particulier in Paris. That was built in 1603, around a classical courtyard with a garden. that is still there today. And then in the 19th century, the whole area was actually getting very industrialized because of the two stations that were coming close and the channels that were built to it. Even this one was built in the area. And a lot of small ateliers were built in the courtyards, like also in the one of the Centre Culturel Suisse, that was later extended and fully covered the courtyard, the garden, fully covered it and became kind of one big entity into this warehouse where they were storing medicinal plants, because the front was a pharmacy. And that then in 1985 got renovated by, I have to quickly look, Atelier Traversière from Monica Donati and Bernard Tibor, in which they opened the courtyard again and made in the back, in 85, very classical white cube space on top and a black box theater on the ground floor with another exhibition space in front. At the time, there was not so much talk about recuperation yet, so actually the whole atelier space in the back got quite cut up and got for 90% emptied and replaced by brick walls and concrete walls, becoming quite a static structure in itself. 1987, they bought a shop as an extra to it, as kind of a facade to the street. So you got this extremely complicated floor plan where you have different addresses to get in there. So this is the shop, this is the exhibition space, the offices, this is the theater space around the central courtyard. So when we started to do the competition, it became basically a competition about norms and rules, because there was not fire security, fire secure. There was no handicap accessibility. There was no soundproof. It was not the heating broke down. So the only things we got was a list of problems to solve within the Marais, where it's an area where you cannot go any square meter above, under, left, right. So the volume is fixed, is protected. But you suddenly have to have ramps everywhere, you have to have machines. So for the Centre Culturel Suisse, it was quite tough. Suddenly you want to renovate the whole place, maybe have more possibilities, but your space becomes smaller because there's actually this whole part just becomes machines, which were dressing rooms before. So we actually started to kind of, okay, how can we get rid of everything actually? Can we actually pure out the whole structure and actually confirm these three typologies stronger: the atelier space, the Hotel Pouspin, and the shop? Can we kind of clear it out as much as possible, make it somehow simplify the whole thing, and actually give it again this status of an atelier that is maybe more about working than it is about representation. And in that way also actually minimize the amount of machines we need, etc. One thing we also did was we moved the whole entry to number 32. So actually you get a front facade, and we could start integrating slopes with a difference of 80 centimeters to kind of marry all those different height levels. So at the end, it was a bit the question, what do we find our project? Where, kind of in this volume where it's a full interior, almost no facade, nothing in itself. So we actually started to talk, okay, can we just work with the thresholds between everything? Can we, instead of adding square meters, can we start to kind of give it a flexibility they never had before? Can we make a theater space that doesn't exist in Paris next to the so many rooms that are already there? And can we work on the conditions of the space rather than on square meters or on form? So we have these sets of big windows that go between the different courtyards and that kind of make this sequence of spaces, not making any difference anymore between the courtyard, which used to be the old garden space, the Hotel Pouspin, and the atelier. So here is this huge facade that can open. Here there's an acoustic wall that can fully open and like this make a sequence where, for example, the theater space can extend until here or can even take in the courtyard. And yeah, the house becomes somehow just an infrastructure. To just quickly run through it, to give you a bit an image of where we are with the whole project. So this is the front facade, which will become a huge canopy taking over actually this corner that was in the 19th century. The building was set back with the Haussmann rules. So we can actually extend and actually take up the whole corner and extend the Centre Culturel Suisse and this threshold to the outside, having to keep with the regulations of the Parisian shop window, but with small changes, like a kind of a weird closed sliding door that's actually not trying to sell, but becomes somehow assigned to the Centre Culturel Suisse. To come into the shop, leading you to the back over the big slope, with a big wall of books. Again, just put in the wall in the space as a piece of furniture, ending up at the end straight into the Hotel Pouspin with a space that can actually be opened or closed to the Hotel Pouspin. And that was also one of the exercises when we started to actually work on the construction site. We started to discover a lot of windows and doors that were closed, like this garage door that was there that was closed off before, other windows. So suddenly the whole project now is opening up to all the neighboring courtyards. For example, here you will have a view, and you will move much more from courtyard to courtyard and have these constant views around. The Hotel Pouspin, another door we found in the back, 2 other windows we found. So this is basically just cleaning up the space and making it as grand as possible for them to use it. Suddenly the whole space becomes visible. And everything that's put in between for the moment, this is temporary, like the walls that are built independent from the building itself. And that in time, also there again, they can take, if they find other office spaces, this one can be taken away. And everything is put in place already to become possibly an exhibition space that then fully runs over the whole building. This space can be an exhibition space. It can be an upper space. It's quite free. And then on the front, on the one side of this space, you have the old classical courtyards, and on the other side, you have the garden that was turned into a courtyard in the 1980s. That we will open up again and actually turn it. So the idea is not that we reverse anything, but we add to it. We start to layer to it. So here we're actually opening up the joints of the courtyard again, between the tiles, going back more to a garden, which is also much more wished in the Parisian landscape today, to kind of open up everything again. And it becomes a very green area, although it stays in this courtyard that was created in the 80s. With a small bar in the back, and here you start to see those big windows that open up. The new facade. So here is then the theater space that is much lower than the foyer space that can then be fully opened up in these 2 spaces or into the courtyard, keeping everything that's functional in the old configuration of the theater. So here is this opening. And then on the top floor, we have the exhibition space that was actually fully plastered and coming quite down, and which we will also open up again fully. So this is a situation today on the building site, very similar. You can see the back wall again. You can have a theater which has daylight again, or that can be fully closed off as a black box. So it gets more possibilities rather than different possibilities. The closed off one, the open one. You can even fully pull the floor. It's just a stackable tribune that can be fully pulled open over the full floor, or we can turn it into a swimming pool when we want. That's where we are today. And then here you have the top floor, which is actually under the composition of these different roof types of the different periods. This is the first building, and then more into the front you have this one, which will give its characteristics, which we're opening up fully again and accepting, instead of kind of the 1980s very symmetrically organized space, it will accept again the mistakes and the history of the Marais, becoming much more a working space than just an existing space, an exhibiting space. Here you start to see the different layers and also the problematic renovation of the 80s we're dealing with now. So the goal at the end is that this is a project that just works with thresholds between spaces, and that becomes an infrastructure for them to change over time. So if the director changes, if the brief changes towards the client, the whole building can adapt with them. a project we did in Basel a few years ago, which also continues in this idea of kind of how can we do just what's necessary, and actually dissolve this idea of what's form, what's not, what's background, what's foreground. If we dissolve this idea of foreground, background, suddenly everything also becomes important. Suddenly also techniques become important. Suddenly everything is becoming part of the project. So this is for Schnetzer-Puskas engineers in Basel, who have their office in the Anfos house, a building from the 60s that was actually very ambitious at the time. Basel was trying to become a metropolitan city, which had as much floors underground as above ground. Having fitness with Roman walls. The columns were packed into Roman columns, quite a special space, with a full underground program. And then this open ground floor plan on the city level. We were asked to work on this space here, because basically the engineers have their offices on the first floor, but they're getting too big, so they're taking over every other space that they have, every break room, every office meeting room they're taking over with desks. So they were actually decided to take on the ground floor space, independent from the space on top, to have a break room and meeting rooms. Like you can see, it's a very bizarre space that is a result of, like you see, the staircase that used to be here that's closed off now. It's still somehow in there. At the same time, it became bigger. It's somehow a result of a lot of decisions over time within this impressive structure that always dominates over everything. But we have quite some particular situations here with columns falling in the middle of spaces. Okay, here. So this is the outline of the building, and the first question was like, okay, if we have to try to solve all of this or kind of clean it out, all our budget will just go into that. So maybe that's not that interesting, and can we kind of accept the space as it is? Space was very low. The floor was described as the client as extremely ugly, but had these shop windows on the street. Here you see these columns actually coming down, and even this one is standing in the middle of the space, and there's another one here. A very confused space somehow, with different levels even between the front and the back, with a very low ceiling. And as soon as we started to see what's in the ceiling, we just realized it was a huge ventilation system and cables of electricity, nothing's connected, nothing working. So it was quite clear quite fast we needed to fully change all the ventilation. Taking the whole ceiling out, we realized the height that was actually above it, which was a very nice height. The rough structure that you suddenly read again with the columns. But also this necessity to solve this, what was happening here. So it became a very technical project in the beginning. We just started to redraw existing tubes, and how can we use the same tubes, just change the monoblock for it, and make them functional again. How can we just kind of keep them there and we don't have to actually change them, even with the clients accepting norms that weren't according to the Swiss norms for these types of spaces, saying, look, it's good enough for us, so let's go with it. If it was good enough in the old days, it should be good enough now. Just adding a few cooling elements and this monoblock. Taking the flexible away and just put the thing straight, the output straight onto the pipes. At the same time, by opening the ceiling, it became a problem of fire security. All the beams were exposed, were never dealt with. They were just hidden behind plasterboard. In this area, we had to install sprinkles over the whole space to make it actually possible. The spaghetti of electricity became also a project of cable gutters. So the whole project suddenly started to play into the ceiling. So all the attention went just to the ceiling and nothing anymore to floor or space. So it became our only focus at one point also in the project. Like, can we then just kind of give back the structure to the space by painting it in a very strong color as a background to all these techniques, and actually make sense of these encapsulated columns that give suddenly, again, structure to the space. making also sense to that column if you see it in relationship to this one. And you read suddenly it much more as a space that's filling up between this massive structure. They were also quite magnificent, these columns. They have like open gaps. They used to do all the techniques within the columns. It was like a circle cut out it was very nicely thought in the old days, but now not really usable anymore. Lights, it became a question of how do we add lights to it. This became kind of a new horizon to the whole space, bringing a new rhythm to the whole space that we can actually then easily also very flexibly divide it in different zones. We had the possibility, because it was a lot of lamps, there was not a lot of budget, so it was actually the opportunity to make the simplest lamp that you can actually make, which is just an aluminum profile with a pre-made LED light in it, which we did together with Lichterloh. And they became also our excuse to not paint anything above the old fake ceiling, because it would have, first of all, become too costly. At the same time, we started to like that you could see the old frescoes of palm trees again coming up above the plaster. It asked a lot of precision. It was actually almost a project that was mostly done in building site, just because of the complication of working with the existing, with assessing it, adapting everything to what's there already. And then the only thing we actually added in the space spatially is an enormous curtain rail that would divide the space in a possible meeting room, could close off the main table for projections, or make a cupboard in the front, in the space between the curtain and the wall. This gave a high flexibility to the space, where you can just, there were two types of curtains. There's the one that is actually darkening the space, and there's one that just taking away sight from the street. And through the different configurations of the curtains, you could actually create different possible situations. The curtains were done together with Chevalier Masson, a Belgium office, who used metal workers, the ones who pour metal, their costume material, for the curtains, and on top a very light transparent curtain, or the other way around. So here you could see through, this one would darken the space. Changing just because of the way you looked at it. And they will also then, because there was only front windows, so they would also reflect the light whenever the light was on, or the light from the street, actually much deeper into the space. So this is for us a bit the project, which is the ceiling plan instead of the floor plan. And the only things we have done on the floor was to fill in the gap of the old staircase with a very simple floor you pour, Giesboden. And the clients actually started to accept the floor because of all the colors changing around. The whole perception of the space changed. And the thing they were the most afraid of, which was these ugly tiles, became not a question at all anymore. And at the end, we just kept it as it was. We had then the possibility to add furniture to the space, a reused kitchen from another project that fitted perfectly in there. And then an enormous table of 5 meter by 1 meter 40 that could be changed in height because there were a lot of people. And they could do a lot of presentations where people would be sitting or standing, or dinners. So it could be easily changed with 3 people to kind of change the height of the table. And a simple round table, which again became a whole work with I have to say, our metal builder, A+R. We designed it together with them, the whole table, of how can you make a table where you don't have to weld, where you can just bend and screw. So it becomes actually a very easy and cheap table to make, rather than a very elaborate piece to build. Out with a facade material as a top. Getting this kind of very layered project of layer by layer, where nothing is clear anymore. And a few pictures. but it's a very hard project to show in pictures because it's so flexible, so changeable, that it's always just a fragment that you can show. And this is, the photographer took the liberty to make some very expressive pictures of the project, let's say. As a last project, it's a bit a different project, and it's maybe the one where we did the build the least, but where that really talks about this idea of perception, which I think also plays a lot in our work. Of how people see the space, how they see the city. This was for the Architekturwoche, where you saw in the beginning the pavilion. After we lost the pavilion, we actually got commissioned for an intervention during the Architecture Week within Basel to talk about public space, but without building. This we did together with Melissa Freudiger. So we started actually looking to Basel, and this is Basel for somebody who doesn't know it. And the most prominent feature of Basel is the Rhine, of course, around which Basel is built, and which is the reason of why Basel is where it is. Because the Feldberg glacier, when it melted a long time ago, it pushed the rubble against the Rhine and made this kind of bend within the Rhine, around which the city then had a perfect overview over the Rhine. But then when we actually started to look more, because the Rhine is kind of the most evident thing about Basel and the most accepted thing, everybody swims in the Rhine, it really helps the city to live. But when we started to look at the Rhine further, and we started actually looking at what is actually the Rhine, what defines the Rhine, it's actually also all its tributaries of the Rhine, because if you start to look more up, it becomes very hard to say where the Rhine actually starts, because it's all these small tributaries that come together. And this is the same for Basel. So Basel here around the bend, there's a lot of small tributaries coming in the city. And then when we started looking historically to maps, we even started to find rivers that are not there anymore. They're teich, so they're actually man-made channels within the city that disappeared over time. And we started to overlay all these maps on top of each other. And when we started to look at the program of the Architekturwoche, they were focusing on 3 sites within Basel that are in rapid development, the Kleebeck area, the Bachgraben, and the Dreispitz area, where the pavilion was here. So quite coincidentally, the 3 rivers, they fell together with, or the 3 tributaries, except for the Birschig and the Birsch, which are the very known side rivers in Basel. The Bachgraben, the Rienteich, and the Sint-Albansteich actually fell onto the development sites. So we started to think, okay, let's look into these rivers, even this Rienteich that is not there anymore today. So the one that's still there is that one, but that's fully gone. The Bachgraben, which is fully on the ground. So we started to actually be also surprised by our own city by looking into that. So if you look at the Bachgraben first, which is an underground river, this is Novartis. It's running all the time underground and just comes right at the end, it comes above ground. But it's known because of its floodings quite upstream. And its whole history is somehow combining the first built city within Basel, the Celtic city that was actually next to Novartis, the pollution of the floor happening right next to it, the underground tunnels, the underground river. So for us, it became this whole narrative of this underground world of colorful ground and LSD colors. Also, Hoffman, the guy who he found LSD, how it functions within Basel, and he took his bike with LSD to test it, and he went on a drive through Basel along this river. So this whole kind of colorful world of underground courses and concrete landscapes, we call it, suddenly brought a whole other narrative around that river and actually brought it back in its presence within the city. The Rienteich, which is the river along which actually Basel chemical pharmacy was founded, because it's water that came from the Feldberg, and which is without chalk, So it was very good for textile dyeing, which is the basis of the chemistry industry or the pharmaceutical industry in Basel. So it was founded along that river. So at the same time now, it's actually really used for the drinking water in Basel, which is pumped up from the Rhine within the forests in the back along the river, and the water is flooded. The forest is flooded with water from the Rhine, and then the water goes into the soil and then gets pumped up again as groundwater, as drinking water, together with this kind of pollution of the first chemistry that was founded there. This kind of conflict, contradiction became our second narrative. And then the third one is the St. Alban-Teich, which is also another one of the man-made channels, because this was a very industrial part of Basel in the old days of the mills. It was full of paper mills, and which was at the basis then of the Kunstmuseum, and which actually now functions because the paper mills, that's where the printing happened. Almerbach was printing a lot of books there, and his collection, he was collecting a lot of arts, is actually the basis of the Kunstmuseum in Basel, which actually the museum for Gegenwart, which is part of the Kunstmuseum, is actually now cooled down by the river that goes under the museum, and they're using it to cool down the museum. There's a small water energy central on the river. And it's this river today that looks very nostalgic. It looks in this nice old neighborhood, but it used to have this industrial past, and we started to have these fantasies about a new energetic landscape possible within the rivers for Basel. So all of this information we brought together in a map, which started to combine this past, present, and future of these three rivers, started to name the Herzog de Meuron Stadium that you just saw before as a big gummy boat that just went up to the river and got stuck on the highway, kind of building up almost a fictional storyline to bring back these three rivers to life within the city. And on the back there was actually 3 stories. And people could walk along the rivers and follow these stories and bring actually back the river that is not even visible anymore within the city. During the week, we traced the 3 rivers back in the city at 5 o'clock in the morning, the moment when it actually starts to become daylight again. As kind of a surprise in the morning for people to find out this line that was there, and then you can suddenly maybe bump on it or walk along it or follow it or not at all. We flooded the Messeplatz, which was the place where the Rienteich, you see it's still the red line of the tracing in the morning, where the Rienteich was running in the old day, a space that's not used at all anymore. And by just moving simply the fountain heads outside of the river to flood fully the space, where suddenly kids start to kind of enjoy it, dogs enjoy it. It became quite a lively space through the day. We invited a collective, Cornflower Blue, to work on the 3 rivers, where they brought back sound to a river, or they had a sound walk along a river where you would listen different to it, or they inhabited a water reservoir that was hidden within the city and brought back to life. And then as a last operation, we did with Hotel Regina, a collective from Basel. We showered in we heated up one of the sources. We heated up another source of a fantastic monument in Basel with a bike ramp around it. For people to bathe back into the fountains, and they made kind of a copy of the Geneva jet d'eau fountain to celebrate the moment where the Bachgrabe actually comes back into the Rhine, which is in the new promenade, completely forgotten, and it's just a small hole in the wall, which would have been an opportunity to bring it back. So the goal was at the end to kind of have these 3 narratives that would start growing back in people's mind and give this then a possible future for the 3 rivers, with the Rienteich opening up within the city again and becoming part of Klein Basel, a part of the city that actually has not much water in it. The Bachgrabe that could become a linear park starting at Novartis, making the park of Novartis public maybe, and going all the way up to Bachgrabe following the underground river, and the St. Alban-Teich that becomes a possible energy generator within the city and for its neighborhood. And we hope that the project lives on and will change something in people's perception of the city. This is a bit conclusion of the lecture. It's quite a dense lecture. It's quite a lot of information. I hope it came a bit in, but maybe we can still talk a bit about it now, and this can maybe help to clear out a few things.